Editorial Wild Oats. My first literary venture. I was a very smart child at the age of 13, an unusually smart child, I thought at the time. It was then that I did my first newspaper scribbling, and most unexpectedly to me, it stirred up a fine sensation in the community. It did, indeed, and I was very proud of it too. I was a printer's devil, and a progressive and aspiring one. My uncle had me on his paper, the Weekly Hannibal Journal, $2 a year in advance, 500 subscribers, and they paid in cordwood, cabbages, and unmarketable turnips. And on a lucky summer's day, he left town to be gone a week, and asked me if I thought I could edit one issue of the paper judiciously. Didn't I want to try? Higgins was the editor on the rival paper. He had lately been jilted, and one night a friend found an open note on the poor fellow's bed in which he stated that he could no longer endure life and had drowned himself in Bear Creek. The friend ran down there and discovered Higgins wading back to shore. He had concluded he wouldn't. The village was full of it for several days, but Higgins did not suspect it. I thought this was a fine opportunity. I wrote an elaborately wretched account of the whole matter, and then illustrated it with villainous cuts engraved on the bottoms of wooden type with a jackknife. One of them, a picture of Higgins wading out into the creek in his shirt, with a lantern, sounding the depth of the water with a walking stick. I thought it was desperately funny, and was densely unconscious that there was any moral obliquity about such a publication. Being satisfied with this effort, I looked around for other worlds to conquer, and it struck me that it would make good, interesting matter to charge the editor of a neighboring country paper with a piece of gratuitous rascality and see him squirm. He had concluded he wouldn't. I did it, putting the article into the form of a parody on the burial of Sir John Moore, and a pretty crude parody it was, too. Then I lampooned two prominent citizens outrageously, not because they had done anything to deserve it, but merely because I thought it was my duty to make the paper lively. Next I gently touched up the newest stranger, the lion of the day, the gorgeous journeyman tailor from Quincy. He was a simpering coxcomb of the first water and the loudest dressed man in the state. He was an inveterate woman killer. Every week he wrote lushy poetry for the journal about his newest conquest. His rhymes for my week were headed, "To Marion H.L., meaning to Marion Hannibal, of course. But while setting up the piece, I was suddenly riven from head to heel by what I regarded as a perfect thunderbolt of humor, and I compressed it into a snappy footnote at the bottom, thus: "We will let this thing pass, just this once, but we wish Mr. J. Gordon Runnels to understand distinctly that we have a character to sustain, and from this time forth, when he wants to commune with his friends in H.L., he must select some other medium than the columns of this journal." The paper came out, and I never knew any little thing attract so much attention as those playful trifles of mine. For once the Hannibal Journal was in demand, a novelty it had not experienced before. The whole town was stirred. Higgins dropped in with a double-barreled shotgun early in the forenoon. When he found that it was an infant, as he called me, that had done him the damage, he simply pulled my ears and went away, but he threw up his situation that night and left town for good. The tailor came with his goose and a pair of shears, but he despised me too and departed for the south that night. The two lampooned citizens came with threats of libel and went away incensed at my insignificance. The country editor pranced in with a war whoop next day, suffering for blood to drink, but he ended by forgiving me cordially and inviting me down to the drugstore to wash away all animosity in a friendly bumper of Fahnestock's vermifuge. It was his little joke. My uncle was very angry when he got back, unreasonably so, I thought, considering what an impetus I had given the paper, and considering also that gratitude for his preservation ought to have been uppermost in his mind, inasmuch as by his delay he had so wonderfully escaped dissection, tomahawking, libel, and getting his head shot off. But he softened when he looked at the accounts and saw that I had actually booked the unparalleled number of 33 new subscribers and had the vegetables to show for it, cordwood, cabbage, beans, and unsaleable turnips, enough to run the family for 2 years. Journalism in Tennessee. The editor of the Memphis Avalanche swoops thus mildly down upon a correspondent who posted him as a radical, While he was writing the first word, the middle, dotting his I's, crossing his T's, and punching his period, he knew he was concocting a sentence that was saturated with infamy and reeking with falsehood. Exchange. I was told by the physician that a southern climate would improve my health, and so I went down to Tennessee and got a berth on the Morning Glory and Johnson County Warwhoop as associate editor. When I went on duty, I found the chief editor sitting tilted back in a three-legged chair with his feet on a pine table. There was another pine table in the room and another afflicted chair, and both were half buried under newspapers and scraps and sheets of manuscript. There was a wooden box of sand, sprinkled with cigar stubs and old soldiers, and a stove with a door hanging by its upper hinge. The chief editor had a long-tailed black cloth frock coat on and white linen pants. His boots were small and neatly blacked. He wore a ruffled shirt, a large seal ring, a standing collar of obsolete pattern, and a checkered neckerchief with the ends hanging down. Date of costume, about 1848. He was smoking a cigar and trying to think of a word, and in pawing his hair, he had rumpled his locks a good deal. He was scowling fearfully, and I judged that he was concocting a particularly naughty editorial. He told me to take the exchanges and skim through them and write up the spirit of the Tennessee press, condensing into the article all of their contents that seemed of interest. I wrote as follows: Spirit of the Tennessee press. The editors of the semi-weekly Earthquake evidently labor under a misapprehension with regard to the Ballyhack Railroad. It is not the object of the company to leave Buzzardville off to one side. On the contrary, they consider it one of the most important points along the line, and consequently can have no desire to slight it. The gentlemen of the Earthquake will, of course, take pleasure in making the correction. John W. Blossom, Esquire, the able editor of the Higginsville Thunderbolt and Battle Cry of Freedom, arrived in the city yesterday. He is stopping at the Van Buren House. We observe that our contemporary of the Mud Springs Morning Howl has fallen into the error of supposing that the election of Van Werter is not an established fact, but he will have discovered his mistake before this reminder reaches him, no doubt. He was doubtless misled by incomplete election returns. It is pleasant to note that the city of Blathersville is endeavoring to contract with some New York gentlemen to pave its well-nigh impassable streets with the Nicholson pavement. The Daily Hurrah urges the measure with ability and seems confident of ultimate success. I passed my manuscript over to the chief editor for acceptance, alteration, or destruction. He glanced at it, and his face clouded. He ran his eye down the pages, and his countenance grew portentous. It was easy to see that something was wrong. Presently he sprang up and said, "Thunder and lightning, do you suppose I am going to speak of those cattle that way? Do you suppose my subscribers are going to stand such gruel as that? Give me the pen." I never saw a pen scrape and scratch its way so viciously or plow through another man's verbs and adjectives so relentlessly. While he was in the midst of his work, somebody shot at him through the open window and marred the symmetry of my ear. "Ah," said he, "that is that scoundrel Smith of the moral volcano. He was due yesterday." And he snatched a Navy revolver from his belt and fired. Smith dropped, shot in the thigh. The shot spoiled Smith's aim, who was just taking a second chance, and he crippled a stranger. It was me, merely a finger shot off. Then the chief editor went on with his erasures and interlineations. Just as he finished them, a hand grenade came down the stovepipe, and the explosion shivered the stove into 1,000 fragments. However, it did no further damage, except that a vagrant piece knocked a couple of my teeth out. "That stove is utterly ruined," said the chief editor. I said I believed it was. "Well, no matter, don't want it this kind of weather. I know the man that did it. I'll get him. Now here is the way this stuff ought to be written." I took the manuscript. It was scarred with erasures and interlineations till its mother wouldn't have known it if it had had one. It now read as follows: Spirit of the Tennessee press. The inveterate liars of the semi-weekly Earthquake are evidently endeavoring to palm off upon a noble and chivalrous people another of their vile and brutal falsehoods, with regard to that most glorious conception of the 19th century, the Ballyhack Railroad. The idea that Buzzardville was to be left off at one side originated in their own fulsome brains, or rather in the settlings which they regard as brains. They had better swallow this lie if they want to save their abandoned reptile carcasses the cowhiding they so richly deserve. That ass blossom of the Higginsville thunderbolt and battle cry of freedom is down here again sponging at the Van Buren. We observe that the besotted blackguard of the Mud Springs Morning Howl is giving out, with his usual propensity for lying, that Van Werter is not elected. The heaven-born mission of journalism is to disseminate truth, to eradicate error, to educate, refine, and elevate the tone of public morals and manners, and make all men more gentle, more virtuous, more charitable, and in all ways better and holier and happier. And yet this black-hearted scoundrel degrades his great office persistently to the dissemination of falsehood, calumny, vituperation, and vulgarity. Blathersville wants a Nicholson pavement. It wants a jail and a poorhouse more. The idea of a pavement in a one-horse town composed of 2 gin mills, a blacksmith shop, and that mustard plaster of a newspaper, the Daily Hurrah. The crawling insect, Buckner, who edits the Hurrah, is braying about this business with his customary imbecility and imagining that he is talking sense. Now that is the way to write peppery and to the point. Mush and milk journalism gives me the fantods. About this time, a brick came through the window with a splintering crash and gave me a considerable of a jolt in the back. I moved out of range. I began to feel in the way. The chief said, "That was the colonel likely. I've been expecting him for 2 days. He will be up now right away." He was correct. The colonel appeared in the door a moment afterwards with a dragoon revolver in his hand. He said, "Sir, have I the honor of addressing the poltroon who edits this mangy sheet?" "You have. Be seated, sir. Be careful of the chair. One of its legs is gone. I believe I have the honor of addressing the putrid liar, Colonel Blatherskite Tecumseh." "Right, sir. I have a little account to settle with you. If you are at leisure, we will begin. I have an article on the encouraging progress of moral and intellectual development in America to finish, but there is no hurry. Begin." Both pistols rang out their fierce clamor at the same instant. The chief lost a lock of his hair, and the colonel's bullet ended its career in the fleshy part of my thigh. The colonel's left shoulder was clipped a little. They fired again. Both missed their men this time, but I got my share, a shot in the arm. At the third fire, both gentlemen were wounded slightly, and I had a knuckle chipped. I then said I believed I would go out and take a walk, as this was a private matter, and I had a delicacy about participating in it further. But both gentlemen begged me to keep my seat and assured me that I was not in the way. They then talked about the elections and the crops while they reloaded, and I fell to tying up my wounds. But presently they opened fire again with animation, and every shot took effect, but it is proper to remark that 5 out of the 6 fell to my share. The 6th one mortally wounded the colonel, who remarked with fine humor that he would have to say good morning now, as he had business uptown. He then inquired the way to the undertaker's and left. The chief turned to me and said, "I am expecting company to dinner and shall have to get ready. It will be a favor to me if you will read proof and attend to the customers." I winced a little at the idea of attending to the customers, but I was too bewildered by the fusillade that was still ringing in my ears to think of anything to say. He continued, "Jones will be here at 3, cowhide him. Gillespie will call earlier, perhaps, throw him out of the window. Ferguson will be along about 4, kill him. That is all for today, I believe. If you have any odd time, you may write a blistering article on the police, give the chief inspector rats. The cowhides are under the table, weapons in the drawer, ammunition there in the corner, lint and bandages up there in the pigeonholes. In case of accident, go to Lancet, the surgeon, downstairs. He advertises, we take it out in trade." Gillespie had called. Gillespie had called. He was gone. I shuddered. At the end of the next 3 hours, I had been through perils so awful that all peace of mind and all cheerfulness were gone from me. Gillespie had called and thrown me out of the window. Jones arrived promptly, and when I got ready to do the cowhiding, he took the job off my hands. In an encounter with a stranger, not in the bill of fare, I had lost my scalp. Another stranger, by the name of Thompson, left me a mere wreck and ruin of chaotic rags. And at last, at bay in the corner, and beset by an infuriated mob of editors, blacklegs, politicians, and desperadoes, who raved and swore and flourished their weapons about my head till the air shimmered with glancing flashes of steel. I was in the act of resigning my berth on the paper when the chief arrived, and with him a rabble of charmed and enthusiastic friends. Then ensued a scene of riot and carnage such as no human pen, or steel one either, could describe. People were shot, probed, dismembered, blown up, thrown out of the window. There was a brief tornado of murky blasphemy, with a confused and frantic war dance glimmering through it, and then all was over. In 5 minutes there was silence, and the gory chief and I sat alone and surveyed the sanguinary ruin that strewed the floor around us. He said, "You'll like this place when you get used to it." I said, "I'll have to get you to excuse me. I think maybe I might write to suit you after a while, as soon as I had had some practice and learned the language I am confident I could. But to speak the plain truth, that sort of energy of expression has its inconveniences, and a man is liable to interruption. You see that yourself. Vigorous writing is calculated to elevate the public, no doubt, but then I do not like to attract so much attention as it calls forth. I can't write with comfort when I am interrupted so much as I have been today. I like this berth well enough, but I don't like to be left here to wait on the customers. The experiences are novel, I grant you, and entertaining, too, after a fashion, but they are not judiciously distributed. A gentleman shoots at you through the window and cripples me. A bombshell comes down the stovepipe for your gratification and sends the stove door down my throat. A friend drops in to swap compliments with you and freckles me with bullet holes till my skin won't hold my principles. You go to dinner, and Jones comes with his cowhide, Gillespie throws me out of the window, Thompson tears all my clothes off, and an entire stranger takes my scalp with the easy freedom of an old acquaintance. And in less than 5 minutes, all the blackguards in the country arrive in their war paint and proceed to scare the rest of me to death with their tomahawks. Take it altogether, I never had such a spirited time in all my life as I have had today. No, I like you, and I like your calm, unruffled way of explaining things to the customers, but you see I am not used to it. The Southern heart is too impulsive. Southern hospitality is too lavish with the stranger. The paragraphs which I have written today, and into whose cold sentences your masterly hand has infused the fervent spirit of Tennessean journalism, will wake up another nest of hornets. All that mob of editors will come, and they will come hungry too and want somebody for breakfast. I shall have to bid you adieu. I decline to be present at these festivities. I came south for my health. I will go back on the same errand, and suddenly, Tennessean journalism is too stirring for me. After which we parted with mutual regret, and I took apartments at the hospital. Nicodemus Dodge, printer. When I was a boy in a printing office in Missouri, a loose-jointed, long-legged, tow-headed, jeans-clad, countrified cub of about 16 lounged in one day, and without removing his hands from the depths of his trousers' pockets or taking off his faded ruin of a slouch hat, whose broken rim hung limp and ragged about his eyes and ears like a bug-eaten cabbage leaf, stared indifferently around, then leaned his hip against the editor's table, crossed his mighty brogans, aimed at a distant fly from a crevice in his upper teeth, laid him low, and said, with composure, "Where's the boss?" "I am the boss," said the editor, following this curious bit of architecture wonderingly along up to its clock face with his eye. "Don't want anybody fur to learn the business, 'tain't likely." "Well, I don't know. Would you like to learn it?" "Paps so po, he can't run me no mo, so I want to get a show summers if I kin. 'Tain't no difference what, I'm strong and hearty, and I don't turn my back on no kind of work, hard nor soft." "Do you think you would like to learn the printing business?" "Well, I don't really care a dern what I do learn, so's I get a chance fur to make my way. I'd just as soon learn print's anything." "Can you read?" "Yes, middlin'." "Right. Well, I've seed people could lay over me thar." "Cipher." "Not good enough to keep store, I don't reckon, but up as fur as 12 times 12, I ain't no slouch. T'other side of that is what gets me." Where is your home? I'm from Old Shelby. What's your father's religious denomination? Him, oh, he's a blacksmith. No, I don't mean his trade. What's his religious denomination? Oh, I didn't understand you before. He's a Freemason. No, you don't get my meaning yet. What I mean is, does he belong to any church? Now you're talking. Couldn't make out what you was a-tryin' to get through yo head no way. Belong to a church. Why, boss, he's been the pisinest kind of a Free Will Baptiste for 40 year. They ain't no pisiner ones en what he is. Mighty good man, pap is. Everybody says that. If they said any different, they wouldn't say it where I was. Not much they wouldn't. What is your own religion? Well, boss, you've kind-o got me thar, and yet you hain't got me so mighty much, nother. I think if a feller heaps another feller when he's in trouble, and don't cuss, and don't do no mean things, ner nothin' he ain't no business to do, and don't spell the Savior's name with a little g, he ain't runnin' no risks. He's about as safe as if he belonged to a church. But suppose he did spell it with a little g, what then? Well, if he done it a purpose, I reckon he wouldn't stand no chance. He oughtn't to have no chance anyway. I'm most rotten certain about that. What is your name? Nicodemus Dodge. I think maybe you'll do, Nicodemus. We'll give you a trial anyway. All right. When would you like to begin? Now. So within 10 minutes, after we had first glimpsed this nondescript, he was one of us, and with his coat off and hard at it. Beyond that end of our establishment, which was farthest from the street, was a deserted garden, pathless, and thickly grown with the bloomy and villainous Jimpson weed and its common friend the stately sunflower. In the midst of this mournful spot was a decayed and aged little frame house with but one room, one window, and no ceiling. It had been a smokehouse a generation before. Nicodemus was given this lonely and ghostly den as a bedchamber. The village smarties recognized a treasure in Nicodemus right away, a butt to play jokes on. It was easy to see that he was inconceivably green and confiding. George Jones had the glory of perpetrating the first joke on him. He gave him a cigar with a firecracker in it and winked to the crowd to come. The thing exploded presently and swept away the bulk of Nicodemus's eyebrows and eyelashes. He simply said, I consider them kind of cigars dangersome, and seemed to suspect nothing. The next evening Nicodemus waylaid George and poured a bucket of ice water over him. One day, while Nicodemus was in swimming, Tom McElroy tied his clothes. Nicodemus made a bonfire of Tom's by way of retaliation. A third joke was played upon Nicodemus a day or two later. He walked up the middle aisle of the village church, Sunday night, with a staring handbill pinned between his shoulders. The joker spent the remainder of the night, after church, in the cellar of a deserted house, and Nicodemus sat on the cellar door till towards breakfast time to make sure that the prisoner remembered that if any noise was made, some rough treatment would be the consequence. The cellar had 2 feet of stagnant water in it, and was bottomed with 6 inches of soft mud. Wheezing the music of Camptown races, wheezing the music of Camptown races. But I wander from the point. It was the subject of skeletons that brought this boy back to my recollection. Before a very long time had elapsed, the village smarties began to feel an uncomfortable consciousness of not having made a very shining success out of their attempts on the simpleton from Old Shelby. Experimenters grew scarce and chary. Now the young doctor came to the rescue. There was delight and applause when he proposed to scare Nicodemus to death, and explained how he was going to do it. He had a noble new skeleton, the skeleton of the late and only local celebrity, Jimmy Finn, the village drunkard, a grisly piece of property which he had bought of Jimmy Finn himself, at auction, for $50, under great competition, when Jimmy lay very sick in the tanyard a fortnight before his death. The $50 had gone promptly for whiskey, and had considerably hurried up the change of ownership in the skeleton. The doctor would put Jimmy Finn's skeleton in Nicodemus's bed. This was done about 10:30 in the evening. About Nicodemus's usual bedtime, midnight, the village jokers came creeping stealthily through the Jimpson weeds and sunflowers towards the lonely frame den. They reached the window and peeped in. There sat the long-legged pauper on his bed, in a very short shirt, and nothing more. He was dangling his legs contentedly back and forth, and wheezing the music of Camptown races out of a paper-overlaid comb which he was pressing against his mouth. By him lay a new jew's harp, a new top, a solid india-rubber bowl, a handful of painted marbles, 5 pounds of store candy, and a well-gnawed slab of gingerbread as big and as thick as a volume of sheet music. He had sold the skeleton to a traveling quack for $3 and was enjoying the result. Mr. Bloke's item. Our esteemed friend, Mr. John William Bloke, of Virginia City, walked into the office where we are sub-editor at a late hour last night, with an expression of profound and heartfelt suffering upon his countenance, and sighing heavily, laid the following item reverently upon the desk, and walked slowly out again. He paused a moment at the door, and seemed struggling to command his feelings sufficiently to enable him to speak, and then, nodding his head towards his manuscript, ejaculated in a broken voice, "Friend of mine, oh, how sad," and burst into tears. We were so moved at his distress that we did not think to call him back and endeavor to comfort him until he was gone, and it was too late. The paper had already gone to press, but knowing that our friend would consider the publication of this item important, and cherishing the hope that to print it would afford a melancholy satisfaction to his sorrowing heart, we stopped the press at once and inserted it in our columns. Distressing accident. Last evening, about 6 o'clock, as Mr. William Schuyler, an old and respectable citizen of South Park, was leaving his residence to go downtown, as has been his usual custom for many years, with the exception only of a short interval in the spring of 1850, during which he was confined to his bed by injuries received in attempting to stop a runaway horse by thoughtlessly placing himself directly in its wake and throwing up his hands and shouting, which, if he had done so even a single moment sooner, must inevitably have frightened the animal still more instead of checking its speed, although disastrous enough to himself as it was, and rendered more melancholy and distressing by reason of the presence of his wife's mother, who was there and saw the sad occurrence. Notwithstanding, it is at least likely, though not necessarily so, that she should be reconnoitering in another direction when incidents occur, not being vivacious and on the lookout as a general thing, but even the reverse, as her own mother is said to have stated, who is no more, but died in the full hope of a glorious resurrection, upward of 3 years ago, aged 86, being a Christian woman and without guile, as it were, or property, in consequence of the fire of 1849, which destroyed every single thing she had in the world. But such is life. Let us all take warning by this solemn occurrence, and let us endeavor so to conduct ourselves that when we come to die we can do it. Let us place our hands upon our heart, and say with earnestness and sincerity that from this day forth we will beware of the intoxicating bowl. First edition of the Californian. The head editor has been in here raising the mischief, and tearing his hair and kicking the furniture about, and abusing me like a pickpocket. He says that every time he leaves me in charge of the paper for half an hour, I get imposed upon by the first infant or the first idiot that comes along. And he says that that distressing item of Mr. Bloke's is nothing but a lot of distressing bosh, and has no point to it, and no sense in it, and no information in it, and that there was no sort of necessity for stopping the press to publish it. Now all this comes of being good-hearted. If I had been as unaccommodating and unsympathetic as some people, I would have told Mr. Bloke that I wouldn't receive his communication at such a late hour. But no, his snuffling distress touched my heart, and I jumped at the chance of doing something to modify his misery. I never read his item to see whether there was anything wrong about it, but hastily wrote the few lines which preceded it, and sent it to the printers. And what has my kindness done for me? It has done nothing but bring down upon me a storm of abuse and ornamental blasphemy. Now I will read that item myself, and see if there is any foundation for all this fuss, and if there is, the author of it shall hear from me. I have read it, and I am bound to admit that it seems a little mixed at a first glance. However, I will peruse it once more. I have read it again, and it does really seem a good deal more mixed than ever. I have read it over 5 times, but if I can get at the meaning of it, I wish I may get my just deserts. It won't bear analysis. There are things about it which I cannot understand at all. It don't say whatever became of William Schuyler. It just says enough about him to get one interested in his career and then drops him. Who is William Shiler anyhow, and what part of South Park did he live in? And if he started downtown at 6 o'clock, did he ever get there? And if he did anything happen to him? Is he the individual that met with the distressing accident? Considering the elaborate circumstantiality of detail observable in the item, it seems to me that it ought to contain more information than it does. On the contrary, it is obscure, and not only obscure, but utterly incomprehensible. Was the breaking of Mr. Shiler's leg 15 years ago the distressing accident that plunged Mr. Bloke into unspeakable grief and caused him to come up here at dead of night and stop our press to acquaint the world with the circumstance? Or did the distressing accident consist in the destruction of Shiler's mother-in-law's property in early times? Or did it consist in the death of that person herself 3 years ago, albeit it does not appear that she died by accident? In a word, what did that distressing accident consist in? What did that driveling ass of a Shiler stand in the wake of a runaway horse for, with his shouting and gesticulating, if he wanted to stop him? And how the mischief could he get run over by a horse that had already passed beyond him? And what are we to take warning by? And how is this extraordinary chapter of incomprehensibilities going to be a lesson to us? And above all, what has the intoxicating bowl got to do with it anyhow? It is not stated that Shiler drank, or that his wife drank, or that his mother-in-law drank, or that the horse drank. Wherefore, then, the reference to the intoxicating bowl? It does seem to me that if Mr. Bloke had let the intoxicating bowl alone himself, he never would have got into so much trouble about this exasperating imaginary accident. I have read this absurd item over and over again, with all its insinuating plausibility, until my head swims, but I can make neither head nor tail of it. There certainly seems to have been an accident of some kind or other, but it is impossible to determine what the nature of it was, or who was the sufferer by it. I do not like to do it, but I feel compelled to request that the next time anything happens to one of Mr. Bloke's friends, he will append such explanatory notes to his account of it as will enable me to find out what sort of an accident it was, and whom it happened to. I had rather all his friends should die than that I should be driven to the verge of lunacy again in trying to cipher out the meaning of another such production as the above. I have read this absurd item over. I have read this absurd item over. How I edited an agricultural paper. I did not take temporary editorship of an agricultural paper without misgivings. Neither would a landsman take command of a ship without misgivings, but I was in circumstances that made the salary an object. The regular editor of the paper was going off for a holiday, and I accepted the terms he offered and took his place. The sensation of being at work again was luxurious, and I wrought all the week with unflagging pleasure. We went to press, and I waited a day with some solicitude to see whether my effort was going to attract any notice. As I left the office, towards sundown, a group of men and boys at the foot of the stairs dispersed with one impulse and gave me passageway, and I heard one or two of them say, "That's him." I was naturally pleased by this incident. The next morning, I found a similar group at the foot of the stairs, and scattering couples and individuals standing here and there in the street and over the way, watching me with interest. The group separated and fell back as I approached, and I heard a man say, "Look at his eye." I pretended not to observe the notice I was attracting, but secretly I was pleased with it, and was purposing to write an account of it to my aunt. I went up the short flight of stairs, and heard cheery voices and a ringing laugh as I drew near the door, which I opened, and caught a glimpse of two young rural-looking men, whose faces blanched and lengthened when they saw me, and then they both plunged through the window with a great crash. I was surprised. In about half an hour, an old gentleman with a flowing beard and a fine but rather austere face entered and sat down at my invitation. He seemed to have something on his mind. He took off his hat and set it on the floor, and got out of it a red silk handkerchief and a copy of our paper. He put the paper on his lap, and while he polished his spectacles with his handkerchief, he said, "Are you the new editor?" I said I was. "Have you ever edited an agricultural paper before?" "No," I said, "this is my first attempt." "Very likely. Have you had any experience in agriculture practically?" "No, I believe I have not." Some instinct told me so, said the old gentleman, putting on his spectacles and looking over them at me with asperity, while he folded his paper into a convenient shape. I wish to read you what must have made me have that instinct. It was this editorial. Listen and see if it was you that wrote it. Turnips should never be pulled, it injures them. It is much better to send a boy up and let him shake the tree. Now what do you think of that, for I really suppose you wrote it. Think of it, why I think it is good. I think it is sense. I have no doubt that every year millions and millions of bushels of turnips are spoiled in this township alone by being pulled in a half-ripe condition, when, if they had sent a boy up to shake the tree. Shake your grandmother, turnips don't grow on trees. Oh, they don't they? Well, who said they did? The language was intended to be figurative, wholly figurative. Anybody that knows anything will know that I meant that the boy should shake the vine. Then this old person got up and tore his paper all into small shreds, and stamped on them, and broke several things with his cane, and said I did not know as much as a cow, and then went out and banged the door after him, and in short, acted in such a way that I fancied he was displeased about something. But not knowing what the trouble was, I could not be any help to him. A long cadaverous creature, a long cadaverous creature. Pretty soon after this, a long cadaverous creature, with lanky locks hanging down to his shoulders, and a weak stubble bristling from the hills and valleys of his face, darted within the door and halted, motionless, with finger on lip, and head and body bent in listening attitude. No sound was heard, still he listened. No sound. Then he turned the key in the door and came elaborately tiptoeing towards me till he was within long-reaching distance of me, when he stopped, and after scanning my face with intense interest for a while, drew a folded copy of our paper from his bosom and said, "There you wrote that, read it to me quick, relieve me, I suffer." I read as follows, and as the sentences fell from my lips, I could see the relief come, I could see the drawn muscles relax, and the anxiety go out of the face, and rest and peace steal over the features like the merciful moonlight over a desolate landscape. The guano is a fine bird, but great care is necessary in rearing it. It should not be imported earlier than June or later than September. In the winter, it should be kept in a warm place where it can hatch out its young. It is evident that we are to have a backward season for grain. Therefore, it will be well for the farmer to begin setting out his corn stalks and planting his buckwheat cakes in July instead of August. Concerning the pumpkin, this berry is a favorite with the natives of the interior of New England, who prefer it to the gooseberry for the making of fruit cake, and who likewise give it the preference over the raspberry for feeding cows, as being more filling and fully as satisfying. The pumpkin is the only esculent of the orange family that will thrive in the north, except the gourd and one or two varieties of the squash. But the custom of planting it in the front yard with the shrubbery is fast going out of vogue, for it is now generally conceded that the pumpkin as a shade tree is a failure. Now, as the warm weather approaches and the ganders begin to spawn, the excited listener sprang towards me to shake hands and said, There, that will do. I know I am all right now, because you have read it just as I did, word for word. But stranger, when I first read it this morning, I said to myself, I never believed it before, notwithstanding my friends kept me under watch so strict. But now I believe I am crazy. And with that I fetched a howl that you might have heard 2 miles and started out to kill somebody. Because, you know, I knew it would come to that sooner or later, and so I might as well begin. I read one of them paragraphs over again, so as to be certain, and then I burned my house down and started. I have crippled several people, and have got one fellow up a tree, where I can get him if I want him. But I thought I would call in here as I passed along and make the thing perfectly certain. And now it is certain, and I tell you it is lucky for the chap that is in the tree. I should have killed him sure as I went back. Goodbye, sir, goodbye. You have taken a great load off my mind. My reason has stood the strain of one of your agricultural articles, and I know that nothing can ever unseat it now. Goodbye, sir.